detectives announced the arrest in the 1972.
Most killers run. They cross a state line. They change their name. They find a city big enough to swallow them whole. Somewhere nobody knows their face. Nobody knows what they did. Nobody is looking. That is the playbook. That is what investigators expect. That is what the whole system is built around. The assumption that guilt moves. He didn't move. The man who killed Jody Loomis stayed exactly where he was. Same county, same roads, same neighborhood. For 46 years, he woke up every morning within miles of the dirt track where he left a 20-year-old woman to die, and not one person who passed him in a grocery store, not one neighbor who waved at him across a fence, not one investigator who had spent decades hunting for him, knew. He sold ceramics. He tended a garden. He put a sign on a white picket fence outside his home and advertised his small business to anyone who drove past. He built an entire ordinary life, layer by layer, year by year, right on top of what he had done. And for nearly half a century, the ordinary life held. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known standing on that dirt road in August 1972, looking in every direction and seeing no one, was that the one thing that would eventually destroy him was already on the ground at his feet. A borrowed riding boot, size 5.5, belonging to a 12-year-old girl named Jana, who had lent them to her sister that afternoon without thinking twice. That boot went into an evidence locker the night Jody died. It sat there for 36 years, examined by multiple agencies, handled by detectives across 3 separate decades, and every single time, nothing. It gave up nothing, because the technology to read what was on it didn't exist yet, until it did, and when a lab technician in 2008 turned that boot under a different angle of light and looked at what 3 generations of investigators had missed, this case, the oldest unsolved homicide in Snohomish County history, finally had a direction to move in. This is the story of how a 20-year-old woman named Jody Loomis rode her white 10-speed bicycle down a rural road in Washington state on a warm August afternoon and never came home. How the evidence that should have solved her murder vanished from a storage room. How a DNA profile cycled silently through a federal database every single day for a decade with no match. How a genealogist working alone over 58 hours built a family tree backward through generations until it pointed at one man. And how, after 46 years of living minutes away from what he did, Terrence Miller finally ran out of places to hide. If you're new here, welcome. Welcome to Apex Case Files, where cold cases don't stay cold. If you've been with us for a while, you already know, we don't leave until we have the answer. Hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me, because this one is going to stay with you. It started with a dime. Before we talk about what happened on that dirt road, you need to know who Jody Loomis was, not the case file version, not the victim profile on a sheriff's report, the real version. Because if you don't know who she was before August 23, 1972, you will never fully understand what was taken when that day ended the way it did. Jody Gwynn Loomis had grown up east of Bothell, Washington, in a landscape that in 1972 was still very much rural America. Farms, horse properties, long stretches of timber, dirt roads that peeled off the main highway and disappeared into the trees. The kind of place where the quiet wasn't peaceful, it was total. The kind of quiet where a sound could get swallowed before it traveled 50 feet. She had grown up in that world, and she loved it, which tells you something about her right away, because that landscape asks something of you. It asks you to be comfortable with space, with solitude, with the kind of stillness that makes a lot of people nervous. Jody was not nervous. She was 5'2", blonde hair, blue eyes, and the kind of person who looked directly at things that bothered her and did something about them. There is a story her family told, the kind of small story that defines a person more accurately than any biography ever could. Jody was walking through a field one afternoon when she came across a group of hunters shooting at pigeons. Not for food, just shooting. She didn't keep walking. She didn't lower her head and move on. She stopped, walked straight toward them, and told them off to their faces. Then she took one of the wounded birds home, nursed it back to health, and kept it. That was Jody Loomis, at 20 years old. She did not look the other way. She had painted a mural of running horses across her bedroom wall. She kept a horse named Saudi at a stable 6¼ miles from the family home on Winesap Road, and because she couldn't keep him at the house, she visited as often as she could, riding out there whenever someone could take her. She was studying to become a nurse. She was engaged to a man named Jim, who had moved into the family home earlier that year. She had turned 20 in June, just 10 weeks before that August afternoon. She had a whole life arranged in front of her, and she was walking straight toward it. On the morning of August 23, 1972, Jody put on a summery crop shirt and jeans. She decided to ride her white 10-speed bicycle to the stable instead of waiting for her parents to drive her. It was the first time she had ever made that choice. Before she left, she borrowed her 12-year-old sister Jana's riding boots, size 5½, St. Moritz brand, the kind with thick waffle stomper soles, the kind you wear when you ride. Her mother watched her get ready and did what mothers do without thinking about it. She pressed a dime into Jody's hand. "Call home if you're going to be late." Jody took the dime, told her she'd be back before dark, and pedaled away. She stopped at her neighbor Linda Hook's back door on the way out, knocked, asked if Linda wanted to come ride horses with her. Linda said no. She was packing boxes, getting ready to move back to California. She watched Jody get back on her bike and ride away down Winesap Road. Nearly 50 years later, Linda Hook would stand in a courtroom and say the words she had been carrying since that afternoon. "I can see her cute little face peeking in my back window." Her voice broke before she could pull it back together. "I can see her." That was the last time Linda ever saw her. Jody rode east along Bothell-Everett Highway and turned onto Penny Creek Road heading into the trees. She had made it about 3½ miles, just past the halfway point to the stable. At the corner fruit stand near 164th Street SW, a 14-year-old girl named Kenda Machoro was selling bags of apples from her family's farm. She watched a young woman on a white bicycle pause at the intersection, then turn east up the hill and disappear into the trees. Kenda Machoro would stop by the county courthouse every few years for the next 47 years to ask if anyone had found out who killed her. 30 minutes later, at around 5:30 in the afternoon, a young couple turned down a dirt track off Penny Creek Road in a dark blue Saab Sonnet. The car had 2 seats. Walter Morris was 33. His girlfriend Kathy Lennox was 18. They were not supposed to be there together. Nobody was supposed to know about them. They turned down that track for the same reason people in secret relationships turned down dirt tracks in 1972. Privacy. A fallen tree was blocking the road. Morris got out to move it. 15 feet beyond that log, a young woman was lying on her back in the dirt. Her clothing was heavily disturbed, one boot untied, a wound above her right ear. She was breathing. She was not speaking. Her glasses were askew on her face and her eyes were open, but she was not there. She was somewhere no one could reach her. There was no time to look for the rest of her belongings. Morris lifted her into the passenger seat of the Saab. Kathy held her head to keep her airway open and used her own body to shield her from view as they drove, pressing herself over Jody so that passing cars couldn't see the state she was in. Jody could not speak. She did not speak again. She was pronounced dead on arrival at Stevens Memorial Hospital in Edmonds. No ID, no purse, no driver's license. The hospital staff did not even know her name. Back on Winesap Road, the Loomis family was waiting. The sun had gone down, the phone had not rung. The dime her mother had pressed into her hand that afternoon was found at the scene that night, recovered by investigators in the dirt near where Jody had fallen. Still unspent, she had never made the call. A detective knocked on the door after dark. Jody's mother collapsed the moment she heard the words. Her father lunged forward to catch her. He didn't make it in time. Jana, 12 years old, standing in the hallway of her own home, watched both of her parents break at exactly the same moment. "I don't remember much after that," Jana would say decades later. "It's like everything went black." By morning, investigators had a full crime scene, physical evidence, biological evidence, a .22 caliber shell casing, a dead 20-year-old with her whole life arranged in front of her, and not one step of it left to take. They had everything. That is what made it so hard to understand later, when the years started piling up and the leads kept dying, one after another, until there was nothing left. They had everything from the very first night. That is what investigators would still be saying, quietly, to themselves, decades later. They had everything, and it wasn't enough. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. What city, what state, what country? And tell me what time it is where you are, because people are watching this from all over the world at all hours, and I genuinely want to know. While you're down there, hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps this channel reach people who've never heard Jody's name. She deserves to be heard. Now let's get back to it. The first suspect was Jim Roberts, Jody's fiancé. He had moved into the Loomis family home earlier that year. They had plans to marry. When investigators went to find him the night of August 23rd, they found him at work at Stevens Memorial Hospital, the same building where Jody's body had just been brought in. He had been on shift for hours, surrounded by colleagues who could account for every minute of his time. He was cleared before the sun came up. The second lead was a ranch owner in the area, a man whose behavior around Jody had been noticed by people who lived nearby, the kind of thing people saw and didn't report until law enforcement came asking. Investigators questioned him. No physical evidence placed him in the woods. No connection held. A tenant on a nearby property had been chopping wood close to the dirt track that afternoon and had trouble accounting clearly for where he had been. Investigators looked hard at him. Nothing connected him to the scene either. Then a tip came in about a motorcycle gang operating in the area called the Reaper's Roadmen. Members had allegedly been bragging about assaulting and killing a young woman. The detail that made investigators stop and pay attention: a .22 caliber pistol, same caliber as the weapon used on Jody. The FBI ran ballistics on the connection. It collapsed. The gun didn't match. The tip went nowhere. 3 suspects, 3 walls, all of it gone inside of 2 years. Then came Ted Bundy. By 1974, something was wrong across the entire Pacific Northwest, and people were beginning to understand the shape of it. Young women were disappearing, college age, attractive, traveling alone, in Washington State, in Oregon, in Utah. Law enforcement across the region was beginning to understand, quietly at first, and then with mounting dread, that they were looking at one man moving between states, leaving almost nothing behind. His name was starting to surface in briefings, and in Snohomish County, people were asking the question that investigators were already asking among themselves in careful voices. Was Jody the first? Had the same man come through these roads 2 years earlier, and nobody had made the connection? Investigators pulled the Loomis file and laid it next to everything they knew about Bundy's emerging pattern, and on paper it fit. Jody was 20, college age. She was attractive. She wore her blonde hair parted straight down the center. Several of Bundy's confirmed victims had exactly that hairstyle. The geography overlapped. The timing was possible. For a cold, breathless moment, the theory held together. Then it fell apart. Bundy did not operate like this. His method was specific, and he repeated it almost without variation. He used deception, a fake arm sling, a crutch, and he approached women in public places, parking lots, lakesides, campus paths. He would ask for help carrying something to his car, and by the time they understood what was happening, it was already too late. His victims got into his vehicle voluntarily. Jody was on a bicycle, alone on a rural road. There was no approach. There was no ruse. There was no car she was asked to walk toward. Bundy also bludgeoned his victims. Jody had been shot with a .22 caliber pistol. The method was completely different. The signature was completely different. Bundy was eliminated. And with that elimination, the last real direction the investigation had pointed in went dark. The case transitioned from an active manhunt to a stack of paperwork in a box. The detectives who had worked it moved to other cases, other files, other names. Some retired in the years that followed. Some died. Every few years, someone new would pull the box down, go through everything inside it, find nothing that hadn't already been found, and put it back. It was technically still open. In every way that mattered, it was frozen. Jody's parents kept calling the sheriff's office. They asked the same question every time. Investigators had nothing to tell them. The years became a decade. The decade became 2. Jana Loomis Smith had been 12 years old the day she lent her sister those boots. She grew up, built a life, had a family of her own. But the case never left her, not for a single year, not even close. She kept calling the sheriff's office. She kept showing up at press conferences whenever the department made noise about cold cases. She kept saying her sister's name in rooms where it was starting to be forgotten. In 2008, 36 years after the murder, she sat down with a reporter and said what she had been carrying for 3.5 decades. "I want them to sweat," she said. "I want them to know we're looking. I want them to wonder if there's DNA that can solve the case." Imagine 35 years of thinking you've gotten away with it. She was talking directly to someone. She just didn't know his name yet. That same year, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office tried something new. They put together a deck of playing cards, 52 cards, 52 unsolved cases, and distributed them through county jails. The logic was straightforward. Inmates talk. Someone might have heard something from a cellmate, a bunkmate, someone who liked to brag quietly about what they had done. Jody's face appeared on the 10 of hearts. Inmates eating lunch in a cell block, inmates playing poker in a county jail somewhere in Snohomish County, were suddenly looking at 2 photographs, one of Jody in her riding gear beside Saudi, and another showing the round tinted glasses she had been wearing the afternoon she pedaled away from her house for the last time. Her case was the oldest in the entire deck. A civilian volunteer named Chuck Wright carried her card in his wallet for the next 10 years. He wrote about her regularly in his column in the Mill Creek Beacon, keeping her name in print, keeping the case alive in the community that had long since moved past it. Nobody came forward. The cards produced nothing. The case was 33 years old, every suspect cleared, every lead exhausted, and the biological evidence collected the night Jody died was sitting in a storage room at the sheriff's office, untouched, unexamined by any technology that hadn't existed in 1972, waiting. In February 2005, a cold case detective named Jim Scharf pulled the Loomis file for the first time. Jim Scharf had been a detective long enough to know when a case was winnable and when it wasn't, and what he found in that evidence room told him that this one, despite everything, despite 33 years of silence and dead ends and cleared suspects, still had a chance. He read every page of the file, every report, every interview, every dead-end memo. And when he was done, he was not discouraged, because buried inside that file was something the original investigators had collected on day 1, but had never had the technology to use. The 1972 autopsy had collected biological traces, forensic samples preserved in evidence storage since the night Jody died. If those samples had survived 3 decades in that room, they contained a complete DNA profile of the man who had killed her. Upload that profile to CODIS, the FBI's national database of convicted offender DNA, and if he had ever been convicted of a qualifying offense anywhere in the country, the system would find him automatically. It would just find him. Scharf made the call to the evidence room. The vaginal swabs were gone. The underwear collected at the scene was gone. The bullet, the actual .22 caliber round that had been pulled from Jody Loomis's skull during her autopsy, was gone, vanished from storage sometime during the long dormancy of the file. Nobody could trace when. Nobody could trace how. Possibly mislabeled during one of the department's reorganizations over the decades. Possibly destroyed during a clerical review that had mistakenly marked the case as resolved. The paper trail ended in a blank space where a box should have been. A Scharf later described his team's reaction in a single word: flabbergasted. Everything they had built their entire plan around, every biological sample that should have made this straightforward, that should have had them sitting across from a suspect inside of weeks, had ceased to exist. The case that was supposed to move quickly had just lost its entire foundation before it started. What remained in that room was almost nothing. Jody's shirt, her bra, her jeans, both boots, items that had been in that storage room since 1972, examined multiple times across multiple decades, handled by the county coroner's office, by sheriff's detectives, by the FBI, and they had never yielded a single thing. Scharf sent all of it to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab anyway, because there was no other move left to make. If any trace of the man who killed Jody existed anywhere on any of those items, anything the technology of 1972 had been too primitive to detect, anything that had survived 33 years in a box, the crime lab was the only way to find it. That was 2005. 3 years passed. In March 2005, just weeks after Scharf reopened the file, weeks before those boots were even delivered to the crime lab, Jody's father, John Loomis, died. He had spent 33 years calling the sheriff's office and asking the same question. He had never heard the word CODIS. He had never heard about the boot. He died in the same month his daughter's case finally started moving again, and he never knew. October 2008. A Washington State Patrol crime lab technician was working through the Loomis evidence at his examination table. He had already been through the shirt. Nothing. The bra. Nothing. The jeans. Nothing. He picked up the left boot, Jana's boot, the one Jody had been in the process of tying when she was shot, and turned it under a different angle of light. Equipment and methodology that simply had not existed when the FBI examined these same boots back in the 1970s. He was looking at the heel. He saw something. A small spot. Faint. The kind of thing that is genuinely easy to miss under the wrong conditions, which is exactly why the county coroner's office had missed it, and sheriff's detectives had missed it, and the FBI had missed it, across 36 years of handling this same boot, in the same room, and looking at it under the same light. 3 separate agencies. Decades of investigation. All of them had held this boot. None of them had seen what this technician was now looking at under a different light in a different era. He brought it under the microscope. It was biological. A tiny biological stain on the exterior heel of the left boot. The boot Jana had lent her sister. The boot Jody had been tying when she was shot. Preserved in an evidence locker for 36 years. Invisible to every investigator who had ever touched it. And now, under the right light with the right tools, suddenly and completely visible. The technician called Scharf. Scharf did not wait for a written report. He got in his car and drove to the crime lab himself, walked directly to the technician's workstation, and leaned over the microscope. He looked at the slide. He counted what he saw. 25 spermatozoa. It was wonderful, he said later. We actually do have what we need to solve this case. The technician extracted a partial DNA profile from the stain. 36 years in storage had degraded it, but not destroyed it. It was usable. It was uploaded to CODIS, and the system began doing what it was built to do, running that profile automatically against every convicted offender in the national database, and against every new entry as people were convicted and added going forward. Every single day, without stopping, no match came back. The man who killed Jody Loomis was not in CODIS. Whatever crimes he had committed, and the biological evidence made absolutely clear he had committed at least one. None of them had resulted in a conviction that required a DNA sample. He had slipped through every net the system had ever tried to cast, and now a genetic profile that could identify him was cycling through the federal database every 24 hours while he went about his days in Edmonds, Washington, selling ceramics, reading the newspaper, completely unaware that the clock he thought had stopped in 1972 was still running. Think about what that means for a moment. Right now, somewhere, a database is running. Cases that have been frozen for decades are being fed into systems that didn't exist when those crimes were committed. Killers who have been walking free for 30, 40, 50 years don't know their name is already in a queue somewhere. That is the world we live in now. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now, because the cases we cover on this channel are exactly the kind that are being cracked open by that technology every single month, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Back to Edmonds, Washington. Back to a man who thought he was safe. For 10 years, that profile ran silently through CODIS. 10 years of automated daily searches, 10 years of no match, while the killer aged and the community around him changed, and the rural dirt roads of 1972 became the subdivisions and chain stores and parking lots of the 21st century. He had watched it happen from the same address. He had watched the farms disappear, and the condos go up, and the landscape of the crime erase itself around him, and he had stayed exactly where he was. In July 2018, Jim Scharf stopped trying to find Terrence Miller directly. He started looking for his family instead. The technique was called forensic genealogy, and inside Scharf's own department, they had just watched it do something that would have sounded impossible 10 years earlier. The same method had cracked the murders of a young Canadian couple killed in 1987, a case that had been frozen for 30 years. Scharf had watched it work from inside the same building. He knew exactly what it could do when the profile was strong enough. In July 2018, he sent the partial DNA profile extracted from the heel of Jana's boot to Parabon Nanolabs, a private forensic laboratory in Virginia that specialized in finding people who weren't in any law enforcement database. The logic behind forensic genealogy is not complicated once you understand it, but the implications are staggering. The killer's DNA wasn't in CODIS, but his relative's DNA might be somewhere else entirely. It might be sitting on a consumer ancestry website, uploaded by a cousin or a second cousin or a great-niece who had bought a DNA kit at Christmas, spit into a tube, and mailed it back because they wanted to know where their grandparents came from. None of those people uploaded their DNA to help solve a murder. They uploaded it to find long-lost relatives, to trace immigration routes, to fill in the blank spaces on a family tree. But if any one of them shared enough genetic material with the crime scene profile, if the biological overlap was significant enough, it meant they were biologically connected to whoever had left that stain on Jody's boot on August 23, 1972. Parabon extracted a workable profile from the stain and uploaded it to GE Deadmatch, an open-access genealogy database containing millions of profiles from people across the country and around the world. The database returned several partial matches, distant relatives of an unknown male, people scattered across different states who had no idea that their weekend ancestry project, the kit they had opened on Christmas morning or ordered on a whim one afternoon, had just connected them to a murder investigation in Washington state that was nearly half a century old. Oregon-based genealogist Deb Stone took over from there. What she did next took 58 hours across 3 days. She took those partial matches, those distant relatives pointing vaguely toward an unknown man, and began working the family tree in reverse, cross-referencing census records, marriage certificates, obituaries, birth announcements, public family trees already built by hobbyists on ancestry sites. She was building a genealogical map backward through generations, following each branch until it stopped diverging and started converging, narrowing and narrowing until the branches stopped being many things and became one thing. The lines pointed to a couple in Edmonds, Washington, a husband and wife, Jaquetta and Albert Miller. The suspect, Stone concluded, had to be one of their 6 sons. 6 brothers. One of them had forced Jody Loomis off her bicycle on a dirt road in August 1972. Detectives ran background checks on all 6. 5 came back clean, 1 didn't. Terrence Miller had a criminal record involving sexual conduct against a minor. In 1968, 4 years before Jody's murder, he had been convicted of indecent exposure to a minor. He had driven a company truck up alongside a teenage girl walking alone, called her over to the vehicle, and engaged in behavior that resulted in his arrest. When police questioned him, he admitted what he had done. He was convicted. That conviction had been sitting in court records for 50 years, but it predated mandatory DNA collection laws by decades, laws that simply did not exist yet when Miller committed that offense. He had never been required to submit a DNA sample. He had never been entered into CODIS. That was why 10 years of daily automated searches had come back empty every single time. He had a qualifying criminal history. The system just hadn't been invented yet when he built it. He was now 76 years old. He was retired. He was still living in Edmonds, within blocks of 164th Street SW, the road that runs directly past the dirt track where Jody Loomis's body was found. He had never left. Before moving to surveillance, detectives paid a visit to his home under the cover of a standard follow-up, nothing that would signal alarm. Miller's wife answered the door and invited them inside. The ceramic shop occupied part of the garage, shelves of finished pieces, packing materials, the quiet clutter of a small home business built across decades. And on a table near the work area, detectives noticed something that had nothing to do with ceramics. A single copy of the Daily Herald, a newspaper nearly 7 months old. The front page headline was about a cold case arrest, specifically how Snohomish County detectives had used the new forensic genealogy technology to solve a separate 1987 double homicide. The same technology, the same county, the same method that had just been used to find Terrence Miller's name inside a family tree built from strangers on an ancestry website. The prosecution would later stand before a jury and argue that this newspaper was not a coincidence, that it was evidence of a man who had spent years watching, reading every article about how investigators were closing in on cold case killers across the county, educating himself on the exact tools now being used against him, and specifically keeping, the one article that described the technology of his own unraveling. The defense would have their answer ready. The couple kept old newspapers to shred as packing material for their ceramics. The headline on that table was simply waiting to wrap a vase. It meant nothing, they would say. It was coincidence, nothing more. The jury would eventually have to decide which explanation fit a man who had been living minutes from a murder scene for 46 years without ever drawing a single glance from law enforcement. But that jury was still 2 years away. Right now, detectives had a name. They had a target, and on the table in his home was an article describing the exact technology used to find him, which meant one question had become urgent. Did he know they were coming? And if he did, how long before he did something about it? They needed his DNA before he figured out he was being watched, and they had exactly one shot to get it cleanly. They followed him for weeks before he gave them what they needed. An undercover surveillance team had one instruction: get something he touched with his lips. Saliva carries the cleanest, most legally defensible DNA sample available outside of a court order. No defense attorney arguing surface contamination. No question about who else might have touched it. They needed his mouth on something he then voluntarily threw away. So they waited. When Terrence Miller walked into the Tulalip Resort Casino north of Everett, detectives were right behind him. He bought a coffee, sat down at a slot machine, drank it, and when he was done, tossed the cup into a garbage can. The moment he walked away from that machine and moved out of view, detectives moved in. 2 cups that had been sitting nested together went straight into an evidence bag. On September 6, 2018, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab called Jim Scharf. The DNA profile from that coffee cup matched the biological profile found on the heel of Jody Loomis's left boot. After 46 years, Scharf had his answer. Terrence Miller had killed Jody Loomis on August 23, 1972. He had been 30 years old. He had lived within miles of that dirt track for every single day of those 46 years. And now, for the first time, someone knew his name. But the case had to be airtight before anyone moved. Prosecutors began building a trial package that no defense attorney could dismantle. A process made urgent by a detail that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with time. Jody's mother, Rosemary Loomis, was 91 years old. She had been waiting for an answer since the night she collapsed on her own floor in 1972. Investigators knew she was still alive. They worked with her clock running alongside every other deadline. They wanted her to hear his name before the system had a chance to speak it officially. They didn't make it. On January 25, 2019, Rosemary Loomis died. 91 years old. She died 75 days before Terrence Miller was handcuffed in his own driveway. Her husband John had died in 2005, weeks before the boot was even sent to the lab. Neither of Jody's parents would ever hear his name. Neither would ever know that the answer had been sitting in a storage room the entire time, on the heel of a borrowed riding boot their daughter was tying when she was shot. On April 10, 2019, Miller came home from a brief outing with his wife of 42 years. Detectives were waiting at the door. He was taken into custody without incident and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. The following day, when the arrest was announced publicly, the people in his neighborhood began processing what had been living among them. The man they knew as Terry, the ceramics guy, the one with the shop in the garage, had spent 46 years advertising his business, Miller's Cove, with a sign on a white picket fence outside his home. That home sat within blocks of the road that ran directly past the dirt track where Jody's body had been found. He had put a sign on the fence. He had waved to his neighbors. He had been, by every visible measure, exactly what he appeared to be. After the arrest, investigators made one final public appeal. When Jody left her house on August 23, 1972, she was carrying a horse bridle. She was going to see Saudi. She had brought the bridle she would need to ride him that afternoon. It was never found at the scene, never recovered from the surrounding woods or the road. Investigators searched Miller's home, wondering if he had kept it. A trophy, something belonging to a 20-year-old woman who never made it to her horse. It was never recovered. That detail remains the one thread in this entire case that was never tied off. Somewhere, that bridle still exists, or it was destroyed, or it's buried, and no one alive knows where. Miller pleaded not guilty. His defense team had a single argument, and they drove it through every day of a 2-week trial. The DNA was contaminated. The evidence chain was broken across 5 decades of storage and transfer and handling by multiple agencies. The only thing connecting their client to a 1972 murder was a degraded biological stain on a boot that had passed through the hands of at least 3 separate law enforcement agencies across 36 years before anyone thought to look at the heel under a different light. They called it junk science dressed up as certainty, and they called it that repeatedly, in front of every juror, in every available moment of that trial. The prosecution's answer was a single number, 980 million to 1. That was the statistical probability that the DNA profile extracted from that boot stain belonged to anyone other than Terrence Miller. Not reasonable doubt, not close. 980 million to 1. The jury heard both sides. They sat with it. On Friday, November 6, 2020, after closing arguments concluded, they began deliberating. Then they went home for the weekend. On Monday morning, November 9th, they returned to the Snohomish County Courthouse and resumed. Terrence Miller was not there. While the jury was arriving at the courthouse that Monday morning, police were rushing to Miller's home off 52nd Place West in Edmonds. Knowing that 46 years of invisibility were over, knowing that 12 people were about to decide his future inside a courtroom he had no control over, the 78-year-old had taken his own life at home. He died just hours before the system that had been hunting him since 2005 would officially name him a killer. The jury was not told. Nobody informed them. They walked into the building, took their seats, and kept deliberating. At 1 p.m. on November 9, 2020, 3 hours after Miller's wife had called 911, 3 hours after the man at the center of this entire case had removed himself from it, 12 jurors who had no idea the defendant was already dead filed back into the jury box, looked at the empty chair at the defense table, and read their verdict into the official court record. Guilty of first-degree murder, the defense moved immediately to vacate the conviction. Their argument was procedural. Miller had died before sentencing, before any appeal, before the legal process was technically complete. Under that reading, the conviction should be wiped from the record. He should be, on paper, permanently innocent. Superior Court Judge David Kurtz refused. In a hearing unlike almost any conducted before it, the judge upheld the jury's decision. He did not sentence a living man. He signed an extraordinary judicial order, affirming that Terrence Miller's guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt by 12 people who had heard every piece of evidence and reached their conclusion freely. And before he closed the record, he said something to the courtroom that cut through every procedural argument, every legal technicality, every defense motion that had tried to reduce this case to a question of paperwork. Labels and symbols are important, Judge Kurtz said, and how this case has ended does matter. Outside the courthouse that day, Jana Loomis Smith stood holding a portrait of her sister Jody. Jody in her riding gear, beside Saudi, the horse she never got to see that afternoon. Jana had been 12 years old when she lent her sister those boots. She was 60 when the verdict came in. Both of her parents were gone. She heard it without them. But she heard it, and she said the thing she had been building toward for 48 years, through every phone call to the sheriff's office, every press conference, every newspaper interview. Every year she had refused to let her sister's name go quiet. Truth never dies, Jana said. They thought it was going to die. They thought it was so old that we wouldn't be able to follow through with the truth. Think about everything it took to get to that moment. A lab technician turning a boot under a different light at the exact right moment in history. A genealogist spending 58 hours building a family tree backward through generations from strangers' ancestry profiles. A surveillance team waiting in a casino for a man to throw away a coffee cup. A judge signing a verdict for a man who was already dead. And underneath all of it, in every direction this case ever pointed, a pair of borrowed riding boots, size 5.5, sitting in a storage room for 36 years, holding the answer the whole time. Terrence Miller didn't escape justice. He just ran out of places to hide. And the place he ran out of room was the same place he had been standing since August 23, 1972. Right there. Same county, same roads, same neighborhood. The man who thought that staying still was the same as being safe learned, at the very end, that it wasn't. That it was never going to be. If this story hit you the way it hit me, if you're thinking about Jody, about Jana standing outside that courthouse, about a dime that was never spent. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you're feeling right now. Tell me what part of this case stayed with you. This community is what keeps this channel going, and every comment, every share, every subscriber is how Jody's story reaches someone who's never heard her name. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Share this video with one person tonight, and I will see you in the next one. She deserved to make it to that stable. She deserved to see Saudi. She never did. But she got something else. Eventually. She got her name said out loud in a courtroom, 48 years later, in a verdict that no one could take back. That has to be enough. And somehow, against everything, it is.